Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. A very warm welcome to this Chatham House Environment and Society discussion series event on sand, monitoring and management for a sustainable future. My name is Ollie Brown. I'm an associate fellow with Chatham House's Environment Energy Resources program, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this webinar today, where we're talking about a really important issue. This is a webinar we have organized in collaboration with the Global Sand Observatory, and it's part of a series where Chatham House brings together leading academics, policymakers, decision makers to discuss key issues in environmental policy. The issue we're talking about today is about sand, its use, how we can use it more sustainably. The screen on which you're watching this webinar, the building in which you're sitting, and the roads which you may have traveled to get to that building all relied on sand. It builds the world around us. It's an incredibly important resource. And it's the second most used resource in the world after water. It's estimated that we collectively use something like 50 billion tons of sand every single year. So we're going to be talking about this with four fantastic speakers. We have Pascal Padusi from UNEP, from the UN Environment Programme's Grid Geneva office. We have Kiran Pereira, from the founder and chief storyteller of Sand Stories. We have Sam Lavender, the managing director of Pixelytics, and we have Louise Gallagher, who is the environmental governance lead with the Global Sand Observatory Initiative. I'll introduce them more in a little bit more detail before they speak, but we're going to be talking today around what is the challenge with managing sand? How can we put in place a transition to a more sustainable sand management, and where should we be focusing our efforts for the greatest possible impact? We have a lot to talk about, only an hour to do so. So here's how it'll work. We'll have the four speakers. They'll each give a kind of 4 to 7 minute presentation to kick things off at the beginning. Then we'll open up for discussion. We have a lot of people from across the world on this call today. We want to really encourage your thoughts, your questions for the panelists. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. You can write in questions at any time into that Q&A box. Please let us know if there's a person in particular you would like to direct the question to, and also who's asking the question. And what you'll see is as those questions come in, there's a little sort of Facebook thumbs up sign that you can click to upvote those questions. So if you see a question that you think is particularly interesting, please vote on that question, and that question will float to the top, and I'll be able to ask that question after we've had the opening presentations. So please do ask those questions. And with that, what we'll do is we'll start with an opening presentation from Pascal. So while Pascal is loading his slides, I will just introduce him. Pascal is the director of Grid Geneva, the United Nations Environment Programme, which is a team of 20 scientists who are working to transform data into information to support decision-making processes. And he's also coordinating the World Environment Situation Room, a data platform for monitoring the state of the Earth's environment. So Pascal's going to lay out a little bit some of the challenges around sand and sand management. So Pascal, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ollie. And it's my pleasure to share with you some of this discovery that we made several years ago, because it is very recent that we start to think about sand as some very strategic material. So when we think about sand, we mostly think about this nice sandy beach, and that brings us back to maybe very nice memories of vacation. But actually, our use of sand is more related to that. It's building material that we are using, mixing it with water, cement, and gravels, and for making concrete. And we use it for making roads, for building our cities, for dams, infrastructures, dikes, tunnels, bridges, even for making glasses, windows, electronics. We are using sand as well for land reclamation. That's an example in Dubai. If you look at the satellite imagery from 2001 and then 2011, you see this palm structure appearing. And this is made of sand taken from the Red Sea. Then, sorry, from the Gulf. And this is then Singapore actually bring its territory to an increase of 23% since 1973 by taking sand from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and even as far as Myanmar. So we see sand as very, very important ingredient for society. It's actually our entire society is literally built on sand. Now, how is sand produced? It is produced by glaciers erosion, rivers, waves, or wind erosion. So it's a slow process, a kind of geological time process that would take between 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 of years to be produced. And we humans are using it in a very, very fast way. We are transforming and shifting this material, taking it from quarries or other resources. We'll see where it's come from. And we use it in a very, very fast way, much faster than it is actually renewing. And this has led to an increase in sand, all of demand for infrastructures and the development, which is needed, schools and hospitals, houses, all this infrastructure we need. Have been increased through time with our economic development. And in the last 2 decades, the amount of sand that we've been using has been multiplied by 3. Now, sand is not monitored globally. So what we try to do is trying to find an indirect way of measuring sand. And we know there is a very, very good correlation between the use of sand and cement. And cement is being used and monitored by every country. So this is cement increase. You see a kind of a plateau. And we're using 4.1 billion tons of cement per year currently, and 58% of that is used in China. If you've been recently in China, you will know what I mean. It's a absolutely amazing development of skyscrapers and so on. And if you see this correlation between sand and cement, we are using about 10 tons of cement, 10 tons of sand for every ton of cement. So 10 times more. A pretty big match if you can see this graph. So if you multiply this 4.1 billion for construction, we roughly get 40 to 50 billion tons per year. And that's enough to build a wall of 27 meters high by 27 meter wide all around planet Earth every year. So where it's coming from, we've got different sources. Some of that comes from quarries, like here, you make a big hole, you extract sand, then you can put some inert material and recover it by earth and plant vegetation back. So if it's well managed, it can be okay, but it still has an impact during the operation phase. Then people are taking it sand illegally. So this is me in Tunisia. We see that sand has been taken out at my shoulder height. So this is placing more vulnerability to people to climate change, sea level rise, salinations of aquifers. People are taking sand from rivers. Lots of rivers in Southeast Asia have been totally exhausted by all the sand has been taken out. On the beaches as well, this is in Sierra Leone, if you look at those trucks, if you look at that after just 1 day of operation, you can imagine the status of the beach, and they will repeat that beach after beach. So this is really a very, very large impact. Then you've got those giant boats that looks like a really, really giant vacuum cleaner, and that's exactly what it does. It goes on the bottom of the sea and it just take all the sand and crunch all the microorganisms that are there, then release fine particles behind. So there's lots of impact because basically the bottom of the sea is where you got the microorganisms that feed the small fishes that then in turn feed the bigger ones. So you got an impact on biodiversity and an impact on the fisheries as well. So is it time for panicking? Well, that would certainly not help. But it's time to take a look and change our perception about sand. It's not a common material, it is a strategic material, and we need to much better think about how we're going to use it in the future. So rethink our consumption model. We have different options. We can reduce sand, we can, or demand for sand, we can reuse and retrofit buildings and infrastructures. We can replace sand by other substitute, which is something we are currently researching. You can recycle sand when it's concrete goes to the dumping site. You can recycle that into rebuilding material. And we have to rethink how we do extraction, maybe introducing a standard for this practice. This report led to a resolution adopted by all member states in March 2019, the Mineral Resource Governance, which specifically mentioned sand as an important issue to be researched upon, and that we need to report on best practices and solutions. So this is what we've been trying to do, and to do that in a better way and coordinating way, we have initiated a Global Sand Observatory Initiative, and Louise will tell you much more about that. So thank you. This is my initial setting the scene for sand. Over to you.
Pascal, thank you so much. In 6 minutes, you covered an enormous amount of ground, talking about some of the challenges, the scope, the scale, the uses of sand, some of the ways of addressing that. That's absolutely fabulous. While Kieran is just loading up our slides, I just want to ask you a quick question, Pascal. Why do you think people aren't more aware of the challenges of sand extraction?
I think it took everybody by surprise. We just think that sand is everywhere. We never thought we will run out of sand, but it's starting in some places. And it is about anticipating what can happen in the next decade or so, because if we don't look forward, if we don't anticipate, we will have massive problems about sand supply, but also about land planning. It just took people by surprise. It's the elephant in the room, I think.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let's talk about what this actually means to people and communities in areas where sand is being extracted. So Kieran Pereira is the founder of sandstories.org and an author of a new book, Sand Stories, Surprising Truths About the Global Sand Crisis and the Quest for Sustainable Solutions. So Kieran, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the session. And I'd like to expand on what Pascal has just said. It is a huge challenge, but it's something that we can address. So sand is used in numerous ways, in myriad ways. It's used to make everyday things that we use and we take for granted. Let's talk about a few uses. Construction, for example, has when we extract sand for construction, there are tremendous amount of impacts. For example, in India, 193 people were killed in 2019 due to river sand mining activities. There's a sand mafia that kills people when they object to sand mining. So it can be quite a contentious issue, and it's destroying rivers, lakes, wetlands across the world. It's decimating biodiversity, and it's also hampering livelihoods. In Ghana, for example, a 2017 parliamentary report found that sand mining was a threat to economic productivity. In fact, they found that about 85% of sand miners were operating illegally. In Korea, for example, a 2009 study showed that the value of lost fish catch from marine sand mining, just for one site, was approximately $39,000. Now, when they looked at the whole district, so 20 mining sites, and they estimated cumulative damages, they found for 5 years, it was 1.5 million. And for 10 years, it was 2.2 million. So when you consider facts like this, you begin to see that sand is so much more than sand. It impacts, so indiscriminate sand mining is a threat to water security. It's a threat to food security. It's a threat to biodiversity. It's a threat to coastal security. And it impacts every single one of the Sustainable Development Goals. Materials like concrete and glass have become the mainstay. And concrete, for example, is 60 to 75% sand and gravel. Glass is 70%. So the question that we need to ask ourselves, can we continue along this trajectory? Land reclamation, Pascal already shared, that it has huge impact. You see pictures here from Indonesia, where you see fishermen trying to stop a huge dredger. In another picture, you see a market where 20,000 fishermen sell their catch. All their livelihoods are impacted by land reclamation activities. Energy sector also uses tremendous amounts of sand. For example, whether it's fossil fuels or renewable energy. For example, frac sand mining uses tremendous amounts of sand. A typical fracking well can use anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 tons of sand. So that means about 50 to 70 rail cars of sand. And methods like supersized fracking those wells can consume anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 tons of sand. So we're talking about 100 to 250 rail cars of sand, a non-renewable resource in human timescales, to frack just one well. So what's the impact of extracting such tremendous volumes of sand from our ecosystems? This is something that we need to look at seriously. Frack sand mining in the United States has raised whole new questions about environmental justice, about health, public health, and about food security. So there are tremendous amounts of impacts, and we definitely need to consider this. So these are just some of the things that I wanted to share. There's a lot more that I can talk about, but before I hand it over to the next person, the one thing that I would like to say is that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Can we promise our future generations that they will be able to meet their needs if we continue along this trajectory? Intra and intergenerational equity, environmental justice must be at the heart of any sustainability initiative. So on that note, I'd like to hand over the session.
Kieran, thank you so much. That was a perfect segue from what Pascal was talking about. Let me follow on from that. You were saying you were talking sort of growing awareness of sand. Are you seeing some sort of community level responses to sand mining? You were talking about in Indonesia, the fishermen who are protesting against sand dredging. What sort of community level responses are you seeing to sand mining around the world?
Tremendous. I think a lot of people are getting together. You find a huge number of nonprofit organizations helping communities come together and develop a response. But it's a David and Goliath kind of battle that they often face. They're faced with so many challenges and opaque systems and processes they face tremendous challenges that need to be looked at, and they need a seat at the table anytime decisions are being made.
Very good. Thank you so much. So we have some excellent questions coming in already. So keep those coming. Again, you'll see there's a little sort of thumbs up sign. You can vote on questions you think that are particularly important, particularly interesting. So rather than sort of writing out the same question over again, you can upvote it. So please do that, and I'll be sure to try and ask those questions. If there's somebody in particular you would like to direct the question to, do let us know as well. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Samantha Lavender, who's going to talk a little bit about Earth observation and its scope for addressing some of these challenges that Pascal and Kieran were talking about. So Sam is the managing director of Pixelytics and the lead for a UK space agency project on understanding sand and sand use in Kenya. She has over 30 years of scientific experience in using satellite data. And is passionate about using data to provide insights to better understand our planet. So, Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, I'm pleased to present a project that we've been working on very intensively, really, for the last 9 months or so. And as Ollie said, this has been funded by the UK Space Agency's International Partnership Programme, which with the funding coming through a government department called BASE and the Global Challenges Research Fund. And within the partnership, you can see the logos at the bottom. We have ourselves as the project lead, the Satellite Applications Catapult, NIRIS Africa, Nairobi Design Institute, University of Plymouth, Chatham House, and British Geological Society. Survey, sorry. So we have a mixture of English and Kenyan organisations involved in the project. And really this first phase, which is called the discovery phase, aims to take what we thought was our knowledge when we wrote the proposal and have discussions and workshops and meetings in Kenya to see if what we thought is true and to plan what would be the solution that we think should be put in place and would best benefit those on the ground. And so, because we've not been able to go to Kenya during the period because of COVID, actually it's been really beneficial having our Kenyan partners as well as in the project. And we've actually been having a lot of calls like this one through Zoom or other media with people in Kenya. And I have to say, they've all been very friendly. And maybe everything is not as negative as it might seem, really. And what we've found from those in-country discussions is that in Kenya, sand is not recognised as a mineral resource. So it's not managed at a national level, but it is devolved down to the counties. And although there has been historically problems, as has been talked about by the previous speakers, actually different counties are on different stages of the path, really, but are all moving towards sustainable sand management. And they have very clear ideas about what they want to achieve, and that it's very much a collaborative and cooperative process where the local communities are very much part of the solution in terms of solving it. And if I go on to the next slide, what we've been doing in this project is, as well as having those discussions, we've also been looking at satellite data because of the resource it can provide in terms of giving us an overview, which has maybe not been possible on the ground or is not up to date compared to what is currently happening at the moment. And so we've been using a mixture of optical and microwave data. And the optical data most people nowadays are familiar with, because you'll have looked on Google Earth to look at your house, and you'll have maybe seen it on weather forecasts as well. But microwave data is coming to the fore increasingly. So it has the advantage of it seeing through clouds, being usable at night, and it can either be passive or active. So either you receive the signal that's radiated back from the Earth for something like soil moisture, or something like the radar technique where you can measure height and surface roughness. So we've been bringing that data together, and there is a lot out there that's now free to access, although you have to have the knowledge and the technology to download it and handle it still in a lot of cases. So we've done 3 case studies in the project. The first one, which I'm showing here, is looking at sand dams. So in a lot of the counties we've talked to, the extraction of sand is coming out of sand dams, which, though their name is sand, is really, they're there to capture water and in the dry season make sure water is available to the community. But by doing so, they capture sand in the river. And then what people are doing is extracting that sand as a resource in addition to the water. And so what we've used is a combination of optical and microwave data to classify where sand is in all the rivers across the counties, and then compare what we can see from the satellite to locations of sand dams we've found by wandering around Google Earth, really. And then calculating the amount of sand we see over time and in different areas. And it's still at an early stage because this has been a relatively short project, but we're getting some promising results from it. Another area is looking at more mining style sites where people have been extracting sand from a pit. And so again, we're finding that with the free to access data, we can classify those as sand. And then from the Sentinel-1 data, we can extract an elevation model that changes over time. And we're starting to see something from that elevation model that looks like we might be able to determine the dimensions of that site. And although you can get elevation models that you can download, they will be created at a particular point in time, whereas this will allow us to do that look every 6 to 12 days. And then the third one is actually extraction through dredging. So I'm showing Lake Victoria here and sediment concentrations. And Lake Victoria has had dredging in it, but also coastal areas. So in this example, we were looking at the concentration of sediment within Lake Victoria, and you're down to a resolution with this free to access data where you can see vessels. So we didn't see the actual dredging vessels that were dredging in January and have been reported in the news, but there is the possibility to do that going forward. Thank you very much.
Sam, that's brilliant. That really, really interesting stuff. Again, sort of taking it from, you know, the sort of general challenges and what we're talking about in terms of some of the challenges as to how to monitor and manage that. We've got some absolutely fascinating questions coming in, and I want to give time for those questions as well. So let's move to our last presentation, which is from Louise Gallagher, who is the environmental governance lead. She works with Pascal at UNEP Grid Geneva at the Global Sand Observatory Initiative, which Pascal mentioned. She originally trained as an environmental economist, specializing in waste management and environmental policy analysis and design, and has worked for UN Environment, WWF, and the University of Geneva. And she is the lead author of the UNEP 2019 Sand and Sustainability Report, which Pascal showed a picture of. So, Louise, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. It's hard to come after a series of such great presentations like that, but I hope mine is clear and visible and hopefully helps to put a bit of a cap on this conversation and take it forward. So we've heard so far about, I guess, the challenges we're facing with sand and gravel resources and their sourcing and their management. And I think we've also heard really clearly about the need to change, I guess, our perspective and our approach to managing these materials. We've not been thinking of them as strategic, as Pascal mentioned, but they are indeed central to development and sustainable development at that. So I wanted to bring up the fact that we've talked also about solutions and that there are many out there. They're probably at a smaller scale and a bit more diffuse than we need them to be right now. And then Sam, I loved your presentation. I think it really speaks to that increase in monitoring capabilities that we're gathering behind us. I guess my message here is that the governance situation we have gotten currently in place needs to actually catch up to both the definition of this problem, the understanding of it, the technical solutions that are available, and the monitoring capabilities. And the why for that, well, the reason why that has to happen pretty soon, actually Suzanne Davidson and the 11 other people who voted for this question, this speaks to this question about, I guess, where we're going with infrastructure development in the future. This one figure is a figure I came across last year and it really hopped out at me. Like 75% of the infrastructure we need for sustainable development by 2050 doesn't actually exist just yet. And on top of that, we've got post-COVID recovery investments coming. And that really does imply that we're facing an even more demand for this material, which has caused some stress on our river and marine environments in particular. And what if we want to have, I think your question, Ollie, is like the greatest impact possible. We think that this governance situation we have right now actually has to find those solutions and find the monitoring capabilities and amplify those to the point where we can really get ahead of this coming boom. We're a little bit behind the curve, if I could say so, at the moment. So here's my visual for what the current governance situation looks like. And I'm going to give a hat tip to Laura Platschkov at the Federal Office of Environment for Switzerland. She originally put this slide together. And every time I come across a new norm or a set of legal requirements or even an informal or voluntary standard, I add it to this PowerPoint. And I think it paints a picture that's pretty accurate of where we're at. It's very fragmented. This is both fragmented, the regulatory landscape and the informal landscape around the sourcing and the use of sand and gravel materials. And the reasons for this are actually pretty, I think, well understood at this point. And so Kieran, I'm picking up on your points here about these highly varied sources and uses for this material. So it's to be expected that we're a little bit disjointed and fragmented. We take sand from quarries, we take it from beaches, we take it in high-tech ways, we take it in low-tech ways. And so that's not unexpected. We also manage this resource at very different scales. Sam, as you mentioned, district level, that seems to be pretty common in many places, but we also have, for example, I've heard in the interviews I'm doing with national policymakers at the moment, reference to the regional seas conventions and other international conventions that also have a role to play in this. So it goes from very, very local to quite global. The other reasons why I think we have ended up in this situation is that this sand challenge, we've talking about it here so far as quite a global situation, and that's true because we're seeing this problem in many places in the world. I think it's worth mentioning that the sand challenges are actually manifesting quite differently in different places and in different sectors or at different points of the sand value chain. So we're not dealing with just one problem here. We're not dealing with just one challenge. We're dealing with multiple. And actually by solving one of those problems, we risk causing some perverse impacts. So Chris Hackney, this is for you. You mentioned artisan and small scale mining. I think it's a really good example. So if we were to solve the problem and to ban river sand extraction, for example, we have to really consider the knock-on impacts for people who are currently making their living out of this. And so it puts us into a wicked problem situation where we have to be quite cautious and navigate carefully the solutions that we choose to put in place. And that makes this situation even more complicated again. And then the final reason why we've ended up in this very diffuse, fragmented situation, I think, is that this material, and Pascal has spoken to this, it's perceived as cheap, available, and infinite. And that's partly because the environmental and social costs aren't really priced in. It seems like we believe the highest use value for this material right now is to extract it from the natural environment rather than keeping it in the system for the other types of benefits we get from it, like, say, for example, climate resilience in coastal areas. So where are we going to now and what's happening next? Well, in some ways, I think we need to speak about putting a little order on the chaos of that crazy fragmented picture. And that's happening. That's the good news. We're not ignoring, I think, this problem any further. It's not as invisible as it used to be. There's two pieces of work I'm going to call out here. So the IRP's work on mineral resource governance, I think, is excellent. It defines a particular set of minerals, which are development minerals, which sand fits in really well to that definition. And they're highlighting this sustainable development license to operate as a new idea that asks us not just to look for a social license to operate when we're extracting sand or using sand, but also to think about the multiple effects, the trade-offs and synergies in a 360 perspective, if I can say it like that. And of course, our own work that Pascal has referenced, I think, called out the need for moving towards solutions quite early on in this game. We've been talking about solutions faster than and earlier and quite a lot, not just about the problem here, which I think is helpful. As Pascal mentioned, that has culminated in something that's quite exciting, this resolution on mineral resource governance, which might well be the focus that we need in this rather fragmented picture. So this is our chance to really scan this problem, scan the horizon, really start to look forward and anticipate what's coming next. And we're taking that opportunity with both hands. And when I say we, I'm going to call out to Kieran, who's been doing this for 10 years already. Ollie, you've been doing work on this too. And of course, Pascal has been at this game much longer than I have been. So it's really a question not so much of starting from scratch, but we are basically working forward to move forward. So at the Global Sand Observatory, that's one of the particular things that we are focusing on. That is an initiative that started about a year ago to really explore what the role an observatory could play and what we could be focusing on. It's quite diffuse, this situation, so there's no harm in taking a bit of time to really think this through. So these are like my 5 wish lists or to-dos, I don't know, that I think would be really important for us to focus on for the next few years. So number 1 is cooperation on standards for responsible sourcing and use. And I mean that between countries, but also across sectors and between public and private sectors. I don't think we understand fully yet what responsible sourcing and use looks like. Now's our time to put some parameters down about that. The second step I've put in place here is to really think about cost-effective and viable alternatives to river and marine sand. For us at UN Environment, that's really the most problematic dimension right now. And we think alternatives will have to compete with sand that are coming particularly from rivers if we have to stand any kind of chance, in fact, of meeting new demand from sources that are less damaging. So this is a big one for us. The third one I'm going to call out is updating our environmental, social, and governance risk assessment frameworks within the financial sector, but also within industry to include sand. It's been a little bit omitted, in fact, from environmental and social risk assessments. The fourth, Sam, that speaks to what you just brought in, bringing in ground level voices, I think is critical. Sustainable development to me is a negotiation, and we're not going to get to the right answer without bringing in people on the ground who are working in industry, who are extracting from rivers for their livelihoods. We're not going to make solutions that work without hearing what they have to say. And finally, I think the big one is setting the right goals at the right scale. So we have to have global goals, but I think regional and national action here is really critical. And what's right for a particular circumstance will have to be worked out in that context. So at that, I'm going to hopefully be on time and leave it to the conversation to pick up on those 5 threads.
Louise, thank you. That's absolutely fabulous. That really kicks us off and like you say, sort of caps this whole discussion where we're talking about the initial challenge and then all of the sort of governance results. We've got some really interesting questions in. We have about 25 minutes. And what I want to do is I'm going to try and get to as many of these questions as I can, juggle them on my screen, and then sort of direct a different question to each person. I see that Pascal has been busy writing written responses to lots of these questions already, which is fabulous. We have lots of conversations going on at the same time, and other people have been providing their own inputs as well. But just to kick us off, you talked about Suzanne's question, Suzanne Davidson, and I just wanted to give you a chance to just talk about that a bit more, because the Mineral Governance Resolution was obviously agreed by 196 countries. Before COVID hit, our world has changed since. We now have all of these big potential infrastructure plans that are being talked about in the aftermath of COVID. And Suzanne asks, do we expect that developed nations are going to fuel sand demand as part of their COVID recovery programs, infrastructure, roads, houses, and so on, to stimulate the economy? And how will this fit with their promises they're making around climate and the environment? So I wanted to give you a couple more minutes to talk about whether you see what role COVID plays in this and COVID recovery.
Yeah, we held a webinar with the Green Growth Knowledge Platform back in October, and the message on that one was pretty clear. Like with COVID recovery plans, we're expecting an increased demand. That's for sure. The other worrying thing we heard on that from our World Bank colleague was just how little sand has been integrated into the environmental and social assessments, risk assessments, and standards for infrastructure planning. So that has got to be something we get to work on, I think, sooner rather than later. We know a lot. I think we can learn a lot quickly from other areas of work that have already advanced, say, responsible mining or responsible sourcing for large infrastructure projects. But by God, we need to get going.
Indeed, we do. Kieran, let me turn to you. Again, this is another question that Pascal has got a really interesting answer on. But Chris Hackney asks, how do you ensure that regulation, the sort of regulation and governance that Louise has been talking about of global sand resources, does not negatively affect the livelihoods of those who rely on it as an income, those people in Sierra Leone, the people in India and so on, whilst maintaining the ecosystem services that others rely on that sand mining is destroying? So how do you get that balance?
That's a brilliant question. I think we can see many examples. For example, in Sri Lanka, there was a project where they trained sand miners, artisanal sand miners, on alternative income generating skills. So they trained the men folk to become fish farmers, and they trained the women on making footwear for ladies. The ladies called themselves lucky ladies, and their business really soared. It improved their economic position, it improved their standing in society and their ability to negotiate. And when a storm destroyed all the cages of the fish farms, the women were able to support the families. And it's also, I think what we need to do to answer that question is to decouple construction and concrete. We can absolutely construct beautiful buildings with alternate materials, with straw bale, with rammed earth, with raw earth construction. We can build, and it's possible. So training people on these kind of skills would be a great income generating skill.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Pascal, there's a lot of questions that are directed to you, so I'm going to try and link a couple of them together, if I may. Antonio Ferraz de Oliveira asks, you argue that sand ought to be viewed as a strategic resource, but are there ways in which we should differentiate between different types of sand and what makes them variable, or what makes them valuable? So that was one, sort of how do we differentiate? And there was another question around what are the different impacts of marine versus riverine sand? I was wondering if you could just talk to sort of different types of sand and how we should react to them differently.
That's a very good question, because we're talking about sand broadly, but there is huge amount of sand that are totally different. So we have sand. Sand is actually not a material per se, it's a size of grain, and the intrinsic material comes from the mother rocks from where it's coming from. So the chemicals of sand can be different from places to places if it's coming from volcanic rocks or from other types of rocks. But at the end of the day, it's the material we're using for construction. So the granularity, the edgy types of sand. So we can't use, for example, the sand from deserts because it's produced by wind erosion. So it's way too round. It doesn't aggregate, doesn't bind very well. So we need this kind of edgy sand that comes from either glacier erosion, river erosion, or wave erosion. So that's a different types of sand. Now, in terms of composition, for some very specific needs, like making glass, for computers, for fracking, then we need some very specific sand, industrial sands that can have much, much higher value than the regular building material. But in terms of volume of sand, it's the building material that is the biggest huge, and for land reclamation as well. So these are the ones that are coming usually from rivers or for lakes, and sometimes from marine and beaches. On the marine sand, it's full of salt. So if you want to use that in the construction material, as a construction material, you need to remove that salt. You need to wash it. So you need a lot of fresh water for that. If you don't do that, it will interact with the iron within your concrete, and it might reduce the lifetime of your building. So that's also a question for marine sand. Is mostly used for land reclamation and beach nourishment, but sometimes it's used for construction, and then it might be lead to trouble. What do you?
Excellent. Thank you, Pascal. Talking about marine sand, a question from Ahmed Khalifa for Sam. You touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but Ahmed's asking, are there technologies available to monitor marine sand mining from dredges, given the huge social and environmental impact of marine sand dredging and the large production of these dredges?
There is, yes. So you can see the boats now on satellite imagery, and if it's a large boat, it would also have a signal called an AIS signal as well, that you would know where it was. And then you also see the sediment plumes as well that come out of dredging activities. Unfortunately, most satellite imagery is just from the surface of water, so it is difficult to see below the water surface, because the light is absorbed and scattered by the water, although you can with different technologies. So it's less common on satellite so far, but more they do it with planes. You can fly what are called LiDAR systems and map bathymetry very accurately. And then also you can do acoustic measurements of bathymetry as well from boats through hydrographic surveying. So when it's being monitored properly, then it's can all be quantified very accurately in terms of, I think it's where it's going on and was not known to be going on, and maybe not going on as how it was expected to, that it starts to cause problems.
Great stuff. Thanks, Sam.
Just addition to that, if I may.
Please.
We are actually doing it right now. So wait a couple of months and we will have a product to deliver on how we monitoring sand dredger on marine environments. Something we've been working on for the last 8 months. another 3-4 months to go, and we will have beautiful maps to present.
Some more questions. There's a question for Kiran from Halanishi Yusuf, which is, while alternative construction materials have not gained so much currency, especially in the developing world, how can we ensure that the sand mining that is going on is done in sustainably or in at least a regulated way? Are we considering financing for such an effort, and how can I have a coordinated effort at a country level? And I'm just going to add a little bit to that, because I know, Kiran, you've done a lot of work on alternatives to sand. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about some of the alternative construction techniques that maybe use a little bit less concrete, a little bit less sand and aggregates.
So instead of trying to make things less bad, you know, I want us to focus on completely different things that don't require sand at all. So the German Environment Ministry, for example, has built their headquarters in Berlin with timber. You find communities in Africa, in Ghana, building rammed earth houses. These are affordable houses. You find a community in Leeds in the UK who have built straw bale houses. And these are absolutely modern looking, beautiful, beautiful spaces. They've reduced their annual gas consumption by 90%. And so these kind of materials are now, there's a lot of innovation going on in the natural building sector. For example, straw bales are available now as panels. So they can be integrated into modern construction methods quite easily. So things like that absolutely make it possible to look at you know, alternatives to sand.
Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. We have about 10 minutes left and lots of questions still. I'm not going to be able to get to them all. I just wanted to turn back to Louise. You can tell me in the text if your drill is still going. If not, we'll turn to Pascal. There was a question. Well, there was a question about from Ahmed again about, would you classify sand overall as a renewable or a non-renewable resource? You can just talk to that maybe a little bit, or you've mentioned it already. And then I just also wanted to, there was a question somewhere around sand trafficking. And there was a picture in your slide presentation of Tunisia. And somebody was asking if I can find the question around what the role is in terms of the illegal trafficking of sand in Tunisia and Algeria.
Quickly, regarding the use of sand for energy, the biggest use is for hydropower dams, because those big dams are made of concrete, and this is the very big one. And on top of that, those dams are preventing those sediment from flowing back to the river. So they're trapping sand. One of the good use will be to use this sediment, which empty the dam, so anyway it's needed, and instead of using sand somewhere else. Other use of sand is for making solar panel and so on, but those are absolutely essential. We're not going to, this is needed for fighting against climate. What we need to reduce is the one from fracking, because this one is impacting climate and polluting the aquifers. Regarding the other question on Kerkena, it was local use, was really poor community trying to build their home with whatever they've got. At proximity on those islands, so they dig their own sand, but it is placing themselves more vulnerable to climate change with sea level rise, salinization of aquifers and so on. So it was not for export, which is happening in other places, but not in that specific example. And you had another question and I forgot.
Renewable versus non-renewable resource.
Oh yeah, it is renewing, but at such a slow rate that under a human lifetime, it should be considered as non-renewable.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Pascal. Last couple of questions, and then I've got one question from a CNBC reporter that I'm going to ask to you all. So you can start thinking about that from Sam Meredith. Glader, I'm going to direct this to Sam, if you don't mind. Glader Lan asks, what impact is sand mining having on climate resilience? As sand dunes and natural floodplains might be disturbed, are there any occurrences of this affecting flood vulnerability? Is that something you're seeing in Kenya, or is that something you're aware of elsewhere?
we have been discussing not coastal flooding so much, but river flooding. And there is certainly an understanding across the counties in Kenya that climate change is having an impact. And sometimes what that happens, as a lot of these rivers have water in during the wet season and not during the dry, actually when they flood, they deposit sand. So that creates some sand resources. But there are questions about whether this is causing long-term problems that people aren't so aware of as the short-term effects they see. So it is all tied up together, and certainly in the project what we've been asking ourselves is how do we get the bigger picture, because that data doesn't easily exist for Kenya, and we've been thinking through that, and you've been part of that, Ollie, in trying to understand the whole sand, like equivalent of the carbon cycle, but the sand cycle for Kenya.
Great, brilliant. Thanks so much, San. I'm going to ask a question of Kiran from Lena Metka, which I think is a really interesting one. You were talking a little bit about people being killed as a result of disputes over sand, and the much publicized stories about sand mafias in India and so on that gather newspaper headlines. Lena asks, sand harvesting is the driver of conflict, such as in Kenya. Could you tell us a bit about environmental peace-building efforts in connection to sand? Are there any ways of using sand as a way of sort of bringing communities together rather than fighting over it?
I suppose in some ways export is being used. Trade is being used in order to fulfill needs. But I'm not sure, given the scale of the activity, I'm not sure that it's not also exporting the problems from one country into another country. So this is something that needs to be looked at holistically. And does that answer? I don't have any other example for.
It's an incredibly tough one. I'm just looking at some of the questions here, and there's loads of really interesting points that other people are bringing out. Marcus is talking about the role of sand in new technologies and additive technologies, also talking about the carbon dioxide footprint of concrete production. Each kilogram of cement produces on average 800 grams of CO2. So again, we're talking about sand here, but we're talking about big climate impacts, and it links to all sorts of things that are coming up in the questions in terms of resilience, new technologies, livelihoods, relationships between countries, relationships within countries, all sorts of different issues. I'm not going to get through all the questions, but I want to finish with asking everybody, each of you in turn, Sam Meredith's question, which is Pascal talked about the elephant in the room, the urgency of resolving this deepening environmental crisis on sand. And the question is twofold. What do each of you think? Is this being addressed sufficiently? And what do you think is your priority to address the challenge of making sand more sustainable? So maybe a minute each from you on that, and I'll turn to Pascal first.
Thank you, Ollie. Certainly, it has not been adequately taken by the governments and other stakeholders. It is still very much new in many of the development policies. There is no even talking about this issue of sand, where it is coming from, the impact on social impacts or environmental impacts. So there's a lot of things to be done. Fortunately, there's also lots of solutions that are bringing. The more you talk about people, there are those solutions, so they do exist. But it's time to wake up, really. The wake-up call was the resolution in 2019, where the government finally, for the first time, put that on the political agenda as one of the emergency to be think about. But yet, no big plan, no standard on how it should be extracted, no land planning on where you should extract and where you should not extract, and make sure you do the monitoring to ensure that. So no monitoring to where it's coming from in most of the places, no enforcement of laws, because countries are pondering between development needs and the protection of the environment, and just go full on development, short term versus long term. So there's really lots to be done in changing the mentality also on how we are considering sand. It's still seen as we won't have any problem with sand supply. What are you talking about sand? It still comes as a surprise, whereas it is, you see the extreme increase of use of sand, and that should really call our attention, because it's still time to anticipate those impacts. But if we don't anticipate, we're going to have a failure, because we have 4 different trends. You have the rarefication of the resource, you have the population increase, the increased need in catching up for the development, and the migration from rural to urban area. All of that will push a big demand of sand, and we need to anticipate big time. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pascal. So some very big trends that this is linked to. Sam, do you want to have a crack at that? What's your priority, very quickly, on addressing sand management?
Well, I think coming from an Earth observation background, it's using this massive information source we now have to really inform people, so they can understand and make those decisions at very much a local level, from understanding the situation. And I think, as I said, the positives in Kenya is people recognise this on the ground in terms of the environment officers and the county governments. It's just they were struggling with the resources to put everything in place.
Great stuff. Kieran, very quickly, over to you.
I'd say a grain of sand can be a grain of change. It's important to focus on good things that are happening. Zurich, for example, is building buildings with 98% recycled concrete. City of Amsterdam has committed to becoming 100% circular by 2050. They aim to halve their natural resources used by 2030. That's the way to go.
Brilliant. A wonderfully positive note to finish on. And Louise, I think your drill has stopped. Last word to you.
It's stopping and starting, so I'm going to try it anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't think the attention has been there, as Pascal has mentioned, but I will say that we've experienced a lot of interest on our side from journalists, from documentary makers, from people around the world, actually. So I feel quite encouraged that while it's not fully addressed yet, of course, there is an appetite to do so. And the priorities, I think I gave my 5, but I will say that there's a lot of existing things that are out there, a lot of existing structures that are out there at global, regional, and national and local levels. And I think it's a mainstreaming question. We need to connect to the agendas of other agencies and the other organizations and private sector, and really show that by thinking about this material strategically, you're getting to a point where you're anticipating risk in a way that you can manage it better. So that's my pitch for the priority.
Brilliant, and well struggled through the drilling noise. That was fabulous. Thank you so much. So we're at the top of the hour. Our next event, and we're going to stop it here. We could carry on for a lot longer. Our next event is next week. It's on Monday, the 8th of March at 2:30 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, so UK time, and it's on climate action and gender equality to mark International Women's Day. So this will be with Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the UK International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience for the COP26 presidency. Anam has just put a link in the chat box to that, so do sign up and register and join us for that. It'd be a really, really interesting discussion. But with that, let me thank Anam Farhan for putting this event together, to our panelists for wonderful presentations, really good discussion, and to all of you for really engaged questions and your attention, your time. And I wish you a very good afternoon or morning, wherever you may be. Thanks again. All the best.